With Hashem's help, we're going to learn today Yevamos Daf Chaf. We left off yesterday Yevamos Daf Chaf Amud Aleph, 7 lines from the top of the page. The last word of the line, Ule Rab Shimon. So, a quick review. We have a machlokes between the Chachamim and Rab Shimon regarding the erva of a non-contemporary brother. The way Rav Papa explained the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, if Levi was not alive when Shimon died, however, Reuven married, died, Shimon then was Meyaben Reuven's wife, and after the Yibum was made, then Levi is born. So even though Levi did not live at the same time as Reuven, since when he came into the world, the widow of Reuven was already Shimon's wife. So there, if Shimon dies, Levi has the mitzvah of Yibum or of Chalitza. The wording we had until now, Rab Shimon the Amar Hoyel Uba Umatza Beheter, since when Levi came into the world, he found the widow of Reuven no longer being the widow of Reuven. He found her beheter. He found her as the wife of Shimon. Shimon and Levi did live at the same time. And V'loyom the Olav Sha'achas Be'isur, Levi was not in the world even for one moment when the wife of Reuven was still the widow of Reuven, which is why Rabbi Shimon holds that Levi will be allowed and will actually have the mitzvah of doing Yibum or Chalitza with this woman. So ask the Gemara, Elamiyato. Now I have the following question. If this is the logic, what will be in a case of Achoisai Me'imoi Shenasa Achiv Me'aviv? The case will be like this. Let me just get this clear. Let's say that Yaakov marries Leah and they have a son called Reuven. Amram marries Yocheved, not related, and they have a daughter called Miriam. Now Yaakov and Yocheved get married, and together they have a son called Shimon. Reuven and Miriam are totally not related, even though now Reuven's father and Miriam's mother are married. They get married, and Reuven dies childless. Reuven's paternal brother Shimon is also Miriam's maternal brother, marrying a sister. So what are we going to say? Ask the Gemara. Can one argue that since when Shimon was born, you know who Miriam was? Miriam was Reuven's wife. And Miriam is Reuven's kosher wife. So is there a logic to say that just because when Shimon was born and Miriam, his sister, was his brother's wife, would he be allowed, God forbid, to do Yibum to Miriam? Of course not. In other words, who cares what the status of the woman is when this brother Levi is born? That's the whole argument of Rab Shimon. So what? The widow of Reuven is still the widow of Reuven. Just because when Levi is born, she happens to be Shimon's wife, that's called Behetera. Why should it be called Behetera? She is the wife of a brother that was living when Levi was not. Why doesn't the Isser remain? Are we going to say over here that that if Shimon is born after Reuven married Miriam, in the case that we gave, and then Reuven dies, so Tisyabim, should Shimon be allowed to do Yibum with Miriam? Since when Shimon was born, Miriam was married to Reuven. Miriam is the wife of Reuven. Yeah. Miriam is also the sister of Shimon. So the wife of Shimon is the wife of Shimon. She's also the widow of Reuven. You can't say that they're allowed to do it because she's still the sister to Shimon. Hachinami here also question on Rab Shimon, even though he doesn't have the limud of the word v'yibma, which is what we learned yesterday according to the Chachamim. Nevertheless, isur achiv shelo yihaya ba'olam lahechan azal. Just because Shimon married Reuven's widow, she still de facto was Reuven's wife. And since Levi was not alive when Shimon died, he should never be allowed to marry her. So the Gemara says you can't compare one case to the other. Very fundamental answer. Hi, Isura de Leslie Hetera. The Torah never allows a man to marry his sister. So just because she also happens to be his brother's wife, so what? She's still his sister. But when it comes to the Isser of marrying your brother's wife, and as we said, no one can marry one's brother's wife. Even a contemporary brother. One of the Arayos is marrying your sister-in-law. But if a man dies without any children, over there that prohibition is lei hetera. The prohibition of marrying your sister-in-law is lifted. Which is why Shimon was allowed to marry her. And when Shimon married her, Levi wasn't born. So it's not that we're trying to free up one of the arayas. The erva of Eishes Ach is freed, is lifted. So Rabbi Shimon is arguing, since it is lifted, it stays lifted. When Shimon married Reuven's widow, she's not considered Reuven's widow, even not for Shimon. Because if she would have been Reuven's wife, how can Shimon marry her? You can't marry your brother's wife. Elama, it's lifted because of the mitzvah of Yibum. Once it's lifted, it's lifted. And now that Levi is born, all this woman is Shimon's wife. She is no longer Reuven's widow. I mean, that's the opinion of Rab Shimon. And like we learned yesterday, that the Chachamim argue because they have a pasuk, an extra word, the Yibma, which says that she's always considered the widow of Reuven, which is why the Chachamim are always stringent, and they hold that a non-contemporary brother can never marry the widow of him. Up to the Mishnah. Okay, this Mishnah does a fantastic recap of what we learned until now, and it adds important dinner. So, Klal Amru B'Yevama. The following rule is said regarding a Yevama, and as the Gemara will right away point out, that whenever the Mishnah uses the words Klal Amru, there's a certain rule here. The rule will be including a certain din that's not explicitly mentioned in the Mishnah. We'll see what that is in the Gemara. So this is the rule. Kol, let's get to Bach. Kol she'isura isur erva. Any woman who is prohibited to one of the surviving brothers under the prohibition called the erva, one of the 21 arayas that carries the penalty of kares, as we learned in the beginning of the tractate, and again in the beginning of the Spedic, loy choyletzes v'loy yis misyab bemes. She will not be bound to the living brother. He will not have an obligation, nor will he be permitted to do yibum, nor is there a necessity to do chalitza. And to add, not only not on her, but neither on her co-wife, if there is a co-wife. So far is just a recap of the dinim that we learned in the beginning. Adds the Mishnah, what would happen if the widow is prohibited on the surviving brother, two brothers, Reuven and Shimon. Reuven dies childless and there's a widow. What happens if the widow of Reuven is prohibited to Shimon, not because she's an erva? An erva will be a biblical prohibition of marrying a woman because of a certain kinship. They're too close as a blood relative, or something similar to that. But what happens if she's prohibited because there's a mitzvah? And as we'll see in the Gemara, Isur, mitzvah means that the rabbis added to the arayos something that's called shniyos. Shniyos means secondary ervas. Women that are not as related as the ones mentioned in the Torah, like a man cannot marry his daughter, a man cannot marry his sister. That's an erva mid'oraisa. There are other relatives that are also close to each other, and the rabbi said that they're too close for marriage, and we'll learn about all of them in next daf. All of the arayas midrabanan, they are called in our Mishnah mitzvah. So if the wife of Reuven, the widow now, cannot marry Shimon because she is a shniyos, she's a rabbinic erva, or if the widow of Reuven cannot marry Shimon because of some type of prohibition that comes from Shimon being holy, as the Mishnah will give an example. Let's say that Reuven and Shimon, if Shimon is a Kohen, Reuven is a Kohen. And there was this woman that was married once before and got divorced. And Reuven married. Shouldn't have done that. Because a Kohen should not marry a divorced woman. But he married her. And we learn together, according to most of the opinions, wherever God says, don't do something, don't marry a certain woman, if that prohibition doesn't carry the penalty of Kaddish, then if someone gave her Kiddushin, if someone affected marriage, the marriage is effective. They are married. They need a get. Prohibited, but they need a get. And now Reuven dies, and now you have the widow who is now connected to Shimon. That would be a case of Isur Kedusha. In other words, she's not prohibited because of a Kaddish violation, because of an Erva violation, but relatively. Only because there is a thou shalt not, because you are a Kohen, you're holy. So over here, what will be the law? Says the Mishnah, Chayletzes v'loy misyabemes. That if the prohibition is either only a rabbinic one, or even if it is a biblical one without the penalty of Kaddish, true Yibum is not allowed to happen. But it's not like we learned in the beginning that since she's an erva, no yibum, no chalitza. No. There is a connection. And that connection needs to be unbounded through the ceremony of chalitza. And as we'll learn later, as the Rishonim point out, the Mishnah doesn't say it. However, if she had a co-wife, the co-wife could have yibum. So now we learn two differences between an erva versus a woman who's prohibited under the penalty of a lav or under a rabbinic penalty. By an erva, there was no connection. No yibum needed, no chalitza needed, not only not to her, not even to her co-wife. By a woman who's now the widow to Shimon, to the living brother, is prohibited by a rabbinic isur, by a Torah lav isur, that will prohibit yibum to happen, but chalitza needs to happen. And if the living brother wants to do yibum to the co-wife, he could do so. And if he does yibum to the co-wife, then the erva, the rabbinic erva or the Torah lav becomes freed as well. Whenever there's chalitza with one, then the other one is completely off. Then the other one is off.
If you're able to just
do chalitza with one, then you can do yibum or chalitza with the other. Good. Now the Mishnah says, now I'll give you another case. Now this is a case based on a din that we learned before. So let's take a step back. Here we're going to speak about a case where there are three brothers, Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. Reuven and Shimon both married sisters. Reuven married Rachel, and Shimon married Leah. Rachel and Leah are sisters. Reuven and Shimon died childless. So what we learned until now is, according to the opinions, which is the Stam Mishnah Rabbi Meir holds Yesh Zika, the din will be that Levi cannot do Yibum with either sister. Why not? Because since he's bound both to Rachel and to Leah, and they are sisters to each other, and a man is never allowed to marry two sisters, so even if he's only going to marry one of them, the one who he will marry is the sister of the other one to whom he already has a connection called the Zika connection. It's called Achois Zikukasei. And being that these Tanoim hold Yesh Zika, so therefore Levi cannot do Yibum with either of them, Achois Zikukasei. What should he do? Chalitza with one of them. Says the Mishnah the following: what were to happen? Let's give this example that Reuven, who married Rachel, before Rachel married Reuven, Rachel was married to Levi's son. A man can never marry his daughter-in-law. Levi's son divorced this Rachel. She married Reuven. Shimon married Leah. And now Reuven and Shimon both died. In this case, Levi cannot marry Rachel. Forget about Achois Zikukasei. There is an erva connection between Reuven's widow and Levi. She, for example, is a daughter-in-law. So, being that the Mishnah began with the klal that whenever there's the isur of erva, no yibum nor chalitza is needed, which means there will be no zika between Levi and Rachel. So who is he connected to? Only to Leah. So in such a case, even though Leah and Rachel are sisters, and they both fell from brothers of Levi, here he should do either yibum or chalitza to Leah. The isur erva resolves the problem of Achois Zikukasei. And therefore, chayletzes oy misyabemes. Next, now the Mishnah explains what is the meaning of Isur Mitzvah. So our Mishnah says Isur Mitzvah, a woman who's prohibited because of a mitzvah, refers to Shniyos Midivrei Seifrim. Women that are rabbinic erves. They are close relatives, like we mentioned before, not a sister, not a mother-in-law, but one step after that. Secondary erves, rabbinic erves. Isur Kedusha, when the Mishnah spoke about women that fall to Yibum, but they're not allowed to marry the Yavam because of a prohibition of Kedusha, our Mishnah understands this to mean a Torah prohibition, but only under the penalty of a lav. For example, a almana cannot marry a kohen gadol. So anytime a kohen gadol will become a yavam, anytime his brother's widow, he can't marry a widow. But marrying a widow is only a lav. We'll see later, a lav and an asay. But there's no kares. So therefore chalitza could be done. Chalitza needs to be done. Or a grusha, or a chalutza to a kohen hedyet. If a woman was divorced and married this kohen's brother, and then the kohen dies, or if a woman already had chalitza, and by rabbinic law, a kohen cannot marry a woman who underwent chalitza. Chalitza is really a widow, but since chalitza looks like a get, because she was bound to a living man, that man is still alive, he just did a ceremony to cut it off, so you're not allowed to marry a chalutza to a kohen hedyet. Or kedusha also includes a mamzeres. A mamzeres, like a mamzer, is not allowed to marry into the congregation of Israel. So if someone's Reuven married a mamzeres, he shouldn't have done it, but he violated the lav. And Reuven dies without children, so now the mamzeres falls to Shimon. Or a nisina are women, or a nasun will be a man that comes from a nation that are part of the Chivi tribe, the Chivi people. These are one of the 7 nations that we were commanded to expel out of Israel, and if they were to stay in Israel, Lo Yisachaya Kol Neshama, we were supposed to kill them out. They lived in Givoim, and they dressed up as another people, and they came to Yoshua. They were really Chivim, and they told Yeshua, I forgot what they told him, we're from another, who knows where, another peoples, and we want to convert. And Yeshua converted them, and they made a pact that they won't be hurt by the Jewish people, and then they told Yeshua, we fooled you, we're from the Chivi nation. So since that they were converted, they became Yidden. And we did not expel them from Israel, nor for certainly not, we did not kill them. But being that they fooled us, Yeshua, the word nasin, there's a pasuk that it says, Vayitneim Yehoshua, Yeshua placed them to be the water carriers and the wood choppers. He gave them those positions. In those days, those were when the peoples were divided amongst classes, these is the lowest classes of people. And we were not allowed to marry into them by the decree of Yehoshua. So if a person married a Nesin, and then the person died, so this Nesina falls to the brother, or the same thing goes vice versa. If a Jewish woman falls, the Yavam is a Nasin, or the Yavam is a Mamzer, this is the cases where the Mishnah said, it's not a Isur Kares, and therefore, Yibum not, Chalitza, or if there's a co-wife, Yibum or Chalitza with a co-wife. Okay, simple. That's the Mishnah. So first of all, the Gemara asks, the Mishnah began with the words klal. This is the rule. Whenever the Mishnah begins with the words, this is a rule, and the Mishnah gave an example, then the din cannot only be in the case of the example. Why say this is the rule? Just give the case. This is the rule means, I'm giving you just an example, but this example will apply to other cases as well. What are the other cases? We learned this before. A woman who cannot have children is called an islandess. This is a woman that is both a certain age, she has certain male characteristics, and certain women characteristics did not develop on her. Correct. The whole purpose of making Yibum, the Torah says, is lahakim as beis achiv, that the living brother will marry the widow, and he's going to establish his brother's house by having a child. Now, if the widow is a woman that cannot have children, so there's no establishing your brother's house. So here, there's no mitzvah of Yibum. Now, if there's no mitzvah of Yibum, Rav Asi argues, so she goes back to be your brother's wife. A brother's wife is an erva, and therefore there's no need of Yibum nor chalitza to her.
Or the tzara?
Or to the tzara. That is Rav Asi. So our Mishnah says, Klal Omru, the Klal Omru comes to include such a case. No, it's marrying an islandess in itself. She's not an erva, an islandess. But in this case, because she can't have children, and therefore there's no mitzvah of Yibum, so Rav Asi holds she's like any other Isur erva, no Yibum, no chalitza, not to her nor to her tzara. Other people say the opposite, that the Mishnah meant to say that we do not hold like Rav Asi. The Mishnah meant to say that this is the rule, kol she'isura isur erva, whenever the woman by herself, not because she has a defect, like a mother and a daughter. A man cannot marry a mother and a woman and a mother-in-law, you understand, or a woman and a granddaughter. There's an erva not because she cannot have kids. She in her by herself is already an erva. Hu de asira tzarasa. That is where she's exempt. Her co-wife is exempt. But haloi isura isur erva. But if she in herself is not considered an erva, even if there'll be a case where Shimon cannot marry her, like in a case of an islandess, tzarasa lo yasira, the co-wife will not be prohibited, and there is a mitzvah of yibum or chalitza with the co-wife. And lemu'ute mai amar Rav Avraham lemu'ute tzaras islandess udeloy kerabasi. In other words, we can learn the Mishnah as authenticating Rav Asi or disagreeing with Rav Asi, and that's the meaning of klal. There's a certain rule, and let's go on.
According to Rav Asi, anyone that's, let's say, over 50, you don't have to do chalitza.
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to. I don't know the answer to. Well, we didn't learn this yet. I'm sure this will be even discussed in the Gemara. The question is, if there's a woman that simply by age, she cannot have kids, whatever that age is, wherever the technology is up to, is that like an islandess or not? I don't know. She
has a co-wife.
Yeah, same question. No words.
Yeah.
Good. That will be the case of Rav Asi. I mean, Rav Asi spoke about a woman who's ill. You're speaking about a woman who's old. So first of all, I spoke out in the Mishnah the case where Rachel was first married Levi's son. Now, a daughter-in-law to a father-in-law is an erva. The Mishnah didn't give that example. So the Gemara wants to know what was the issue with one of the widows. Is she prohibited only because of a lav, or is she also prohibited because of an erva? What is the case of the Mishnah? If the case of the Mishnah, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Reuven and Shimon married Rachel and Leah, and they both died. But one of the sisters, let's say Rachel, was already prohibited to Levi because of a rabbinic prohibition, then that's not the case of the Mishnah. Because if Kivan the Midoraisa Ramya Kamei, if the Mishnah would be referring to a case where the living brother can only not marry one of the widows because of a rabbinic prohibition, but by Torah he should be allowed to, then Paga b'achayzuku kasei, our Mishnah holds yesh zika. Ella, the Mishnah is speaking about a case that one of the widows is an isur erva, and by an isur erva, that's the klal amru, no yibum, no chalitza. So ironically here it resolves the achayzuku kasei. So therefore, the living brother has to do yibum or chalitza on the other wife, on the wife with whom there was no prohibition with him in marriage. When the Mishnah said the words isur mitzvah, if there's a woman that's only prohibited because of a prohibition of a mitzvah, what was the Mishnah referring to? The Mishnah interpreted itself. Shniyos. We're speaking about these women, as God willing we said we'll mention in Daf Chaf Aleph, that are rabbinic arroyos. So the Gemara asks, if it's a rabbinic prohibition, why are they called mitzvah? Amai korele isur mitzvah. So Amar Abayim mitzvah l'shmoya devir chachamim. Fakert, being that it's only a rabbinic law, many times people say the words only, it's a rabbinic law. And here we're not speaking with any prohibition. Here we're speaking about prohibitions of kinship, of arroyes, which has an impact on the next generation. So I'm not minimizing any rabbinic law, but a rabbinic law that has an impact on the generations of the Jewish people, on the building of the Jewish people, we call that a mitzvah. And remember, it's a mitzvah to listen to the words of the sages.
Why, someone that came out of a rabbinic arayos would be considered a mamzer?
No, but which is why you won't consider it that serious. So we call it a mitzvah. And what's the mitzvah? L'shmaya divrei chachamim. And that's based on a pasuk. Hashem says that don't deviate from what the sages tell you, nor right, nor left. When we perform a rabbinic mitzvah, we make a bracha. Even though there's a debate about that, but we paskin, for example, halal is a rabbinic mitzvah. We say Asher Kiddishanu b'mitzvaysav v'tzivanu. When we light the menorah, Chanukah, Asher Kiddishanu b'mitzvaysav v'tzivanu. God never commanded us to keep Chanukah. God commanded us to listen to the sages. It's a mitzvah from the Torah to listen to the sages. That's why the Mishnah says over here, mitzvah. When the Mishnah said the words Isser Kedusha, if there's a woman that's prohibited to marry the living, the surviving brother, the Yavam, because of a prohibition called Kedusha. So what was the Mishnah referring to? So the Mishnah itself explained either a Almana to a Kohen Gadol, or a Gerusha, or a Chalutza to a Kohen Hedit. So ask the Gemara, V'amai karaluhu Isur Kedusha. Why are we using the words Kedusha? It should say Isur. Because it says, Kedoshim yu leloikeichem. It says that we should be holy regarding Kahanim. So any Isur, any prohibition that comes because of the additional sanctity that Kahanim have, is called a prohibition that comes from holiness. Tanya, we learned, Rabbi Yehuda had a Braisa which said exactly the same din of the Mishnah. And that Braisa also spoke about an Isur Mitzvah and an Isur Kedusha. But in that Braisa, the meaning of mitzvah and the meaning of kedusha is exactly the opposite of what it means over here. That they're machlif. When the Braisa says the words isur mitzvah, the mitzvah there is not rabbinic shniyos. No. Mitzvah is the Torah prohibition of a widow to a kohen gadol, or a woman that was already divorced, or a woman that already underwent a chalitza to a kohen hediyat. And now we have to understand now the reverse. Isur mitzvah. Why would...
Could it be either way in both cases?
Yeah, but you have to know...
Should be like that,
No, because the Mishnah itself said, that Isur mitzvah shniyas min divrei seifrim. The Mishnah said these words. Now why that Braisa of Rabbi Yehuda called Isur mitzvah the prohibition of a almana to a kohen gadol, or a grusha to a chalutz to a kohen hediyat? Because it says at the end of the whole Chumash Vayikra, this is the last pasuk where we say Chazak. It says Eila ha-mitzvahs. These are the mitzvahs that God commanded, and these are the mitzvahs refer to all of the mitzvahs written in the Chumash Vayikra, which is the book given to Leviim and to Kahanim, including in the book of Vayikra, Parshas Kedoshim. We have the Isurim of an almana to a kohen gadol, a grusha and a chalutza to a kohen hediyat, and that's the meaning of Eila ha-mitzvahs. Isur Kedusha goes to Shnius Medivrei Seifrim. Why are the rabbinic Shniyos, the rabbinic Arayos, called Kedusha? Abai explains, because Kol HaMakayim Divrei Chachamim, whoever listens to what the sages say, Nikra Kodesh is called holy. So Rava doesn't like that, because the opposite of holy is not holy. Not holy is not evil, not holy is not bad, it's just not holy. If the word Kedusha refers to the rabbinic mitzvahs or the rabbinic prohibitions, so Abai is Amalei Rava v'chol she'einu mekayim divrei chachamim. If a person will not listen to the sages, is it only that Kadesh hu deloi mikri? Is it only that he's not called a holy person, but Rasha nami loi mikri? Is he not even called a Rasha? So when the rabbis give a rule, you have to obey those rules, not because you want to be holy. You have to obey those rules because if you don't, you'll be considered a wicked person. Elamar Rava says that the word Kadosh is not a name that's given to someone who keeps the rabbinic laws. The word Kadosh is describing the nature of the rabbinic law. Why did the rabbi say that certain women that are not directly related to you, they're related once removed, they also are prohibited on you? Because there is a concept called Kadesh Atzmacha B'mutalach, that a person should sanctify oneself even in things that by Torah law are permitted to the person. And as Rashi says, and we'll get back to this, God willing, at the end of the shir, that Kadesh Atzmacha, Rashi says, La'amoid ulihizoir, that the rabbis want you to stand up and to be careful. In other words, to put a fence around the laws of the Torah. Because if you won't put a fence around the laws of the Torah, then if you break the rule, you already broke God's rule. If you put an additional fence, then even if, God forbid, you break that fence, at least you didn't break the Torah fence. So Kadesh Atzmacha b'mutalach is simply a way of describing rabbinic laws. The rabbis added additional kedusha in this sense, at least al pinigla, of kedusha meaning separation, additional separations. Not only do we need to be separated from the 21 arayos, we have to be separated from many other what we call shniyos as well, and that's why the Baraisa uses the word kedusha. And if we'll have time at the end of the shir, we'll go back into this Kadesh Atzmacha b'mutalach. Okay. Amayin l'kohen gadol. Amayin l'kohen gadol, says the Gemara, being that the Mishnah did not differentiate whether the original marriage was a full-fledged marriage, or if the original marriage was only the first stage of marriage, which is called Kiddushin. And as we said before, I think already a few times, that the mitzvah of Yibum comes up, not only if Reuven was fully married to his wife, to Rachel. Even if Reuven was only engaged, a Torah engagement, he gave her either kesef, shtar, or bia. He gave her the ring today, in front of two witnesses, and he told her, Hareyat Nikodeshetli. And in those days, it used to take them normally a year in between the engagement, the Torah engagement, and the marriage. If during that year Reuven died, there is the mitzvah of Yibum and Chalitza. The mitzvah of Yibum and Chalitza comes the moment the brother was engaged. Now, the Mishnah did not differentiate here when it comes to an almana, to a kohen gadol, between min hanasoy min ha'erusin. It's unequivocally the same that the Mishnah says that if Reuven and Shimon, the Kohanim, Shimon became the kohen gadol, Reuven married Rachel, but not married or even just engaged, and Reuven dies, so the Mishnah says Shimon cannot do Yibum. Why not? Because he's a kohen gadol. So what? Now we're going to go back to what we learned in the beginning of the whole tractate. Don't get nervous, it's going to be exciting. What was the whole beginning of the tractate? We learned the sugya of esse doicha loisese. Does a positive commandment overrule a negative commandment? We learned this in the context that even if the widow was an erva, who says you shouldn't marry her? So the quick conclusion was that whenever the lav has kodis, a positive commandment does not overrule a negative commandment that has kodis. But a positive a mitzvah saseh and a negative commandment that does not have kodis, if they can't collide, and if you have to do something that's either going to be the keeping of a mitzvah or the violation of the negative commandment, the rule is an essa is doicha loisase. Why does the Mishnah over here say that if Shimon the kohen gadol now is connected to Reuven, to his brother's widow, he cannot do yibum? Chalitza, yeah, yibum, not why not yibum? The mitzvah of yibum is a mitzvah saseh. And the Gemara is going to say the following: if Reuven was fully married to his wife, that means there was Erusin and Kiddushin, then the kohen gadol Shimon is not allowed to marry her for two reasons. First of all, there's a positive commandment that a kohen gadol should marry a virgin. Ki im psula, she's not a psula if she was fully married to Reuven. And the Torah says a kohen gadol should not marry an almana. A kohen gadol should not marry a widow. So if she was fully married to Reuven, so now Shimon doing Yibum would be a violation of both a positive and a negative. That makes sense. The positive mitzvah of Yibum, a mitzvah saseh, cannot overrule a positive and a negative. But being that the Mishnah was unequivocal, the Mishnah said across the board, an almana to a kohen gadol never does Yibum. That will also include a case where she's only a widow from an engagement. So presumably she's still a psula, so there's no violation of a positive commandment. She is a virgin. Elamah, she's a widow. Okay, so there's a positive mitzvah of Yibum should overrule the negative prohibition of an almana to a kohen gadol. Why can he not marry her in Yibum? That's the question. Inside. You have both an asay. She has to be a psula, and the loisasa, you're not allowed to marry a widow. The ein esse of Yibum, doicha loisasa ve'esse. But if the Mishnah is also including the case of Erusin, in other words, she never had a relation with the brother, with the deceased brother, she's still a psula, but she's an almana. which is a lav. So what? So it's a loisa segereda of an almana. So why not yava yasei of yibum v'yitches loisa of an almana to a kohen gadol? Kasha. A great question.
She's only engaged with a separate star.
Or, well, correct, very well. Obviously, if it would be a case of biblical engagement of a bia, then she would not be a psula. However, the Gemara asked the question at a time when the rabbis already prohibited a man to make an engagement with his wife through bia. So these are the only two options we have. Correct. So now the Gemara gives the first answer. Amar Rav Gidl, Amar Rav. Rav Gidl says in the name of Rav, the reason why the almana cannot marry a kohen gadol is because God made that prohibition. Where did God make this prohibition? It says the following. It says that in the case where the living brother does not want to marry his deceased brother's wife, so va'osa yevimta hashara. So then his Yevama goes up to the gate. Just to know the taich, the gate refers to the gate of Bezdin. The Torah speaks about her going up to the gate is because we wanted for the chalitza ceremony to happen in public. Everyone should know that she did chalitza. Now, the question the Gemara has here is on the word Yevimtoi. The whole pasuk and the whole portion is speaking about a Yavam and a Yevama. That he wants, he marries her, which is the ideal. But if he doesn't want to marry the Yevama, so then it should say she should go up to the gate. She would be enough. We're already speaking about her, a Yevama. Why? Why did Hashem say the words Yevimtai? The Gemara gives a fantastic, Rav says a fantastic insight. If the Torah would have said she, that if he didn't want to do Yibum with her, then she should get Chalitza, you would think that you know when Chalitza is needed if there was a real option of Yibum. So he should have done Yibum. And then the Parsha says, but if he chose not to do Yibum, then she should go up and get Chalitza. The truth is that there are cases, which is the cases of our Mishnah, where Yibum is prohibited, but still you need to do Chalitza. So God needed to add a word Yevimta to tell you that there is a Yevama that needs Chalitza even though there wasn't the option of Yibum. That Yesh L'cha Yevama, which is this case. Which case is it? The Almana to a Kohen Gadol. Where's the base of the Bach? Yesh L'cha Yevama Cheres. That there is a Yevama, it's not that he didn't want to do Yibum. God does not allow Yibum. Nevertheless, you need chalitza. So this comes to include any time God said don't have such a marriage, like a grusha to a kohen, like an almana to a kohen gadol. Only an almana, even though she's a psula. Since God says I don't want that marriage to happen, so here chalitza is needed and yibum is prohibited. We learn both dinim from this pasuk. So the Gemara says, now we're going back to the beginning. If God is telling you that even where Yibum is a non-option, you need Chalitza, why should that not also go to the cases of a real Erva? So here the Torah says, no, because the Pasuk also says that Chalitza should be done to a woman who you didn't want to do Yibum to. There is a link between Chalitza and Yibum. That if he didn't want to marry her, meaning that he had an option, so the Gemara says, any woman who the man could have done yibum to, there, if he doesn't, he needs to do chalitza. But if a woman is not even allowed in yibum, then there's no need for chalitza. So why does that not include chayav ilavin? So the Gemara says because you have an extra word yivimtoi. In other words, you have a link between yibum and chalitza, and you have the extra word yivimtoi to separate them. So the Gemara says, Umara Isa, why are you excluding chayve krises and including chayav ilavin? Turning the page, daf chaf amid base. Mistabra, chayav ilavin makes so much sense. Even though God said that a kohen gadol is not allowed to marry an almana, a kohen is not allowed to marry a divorced woman, we are of the opinion that wherever there is only an Isur Lav, Kiddushin takes effect. So the man actually could have married her. Even the Kohen Gadol could have married her. He shouldn't have, but if he would have given her Kiddushin, there would have been Kiddushin. So in the cases where this chayavi lavin, where de facto tafsi b'hu kedushin, in such a case, if the person is doing the right thing and not breaking God's law and not doing yibum, still he needs to do chalitza. However, by chayavi krisus, where it's not shayach kedushin, because even if a man is going to give a ring to his sister and say harayat mikodesh li, there is no kedushin at all. That is where the Torah is linking yibum and chalitza to tell you that if the man can want, but anyways it won't work, chalitza is not needed. Okay, so bottom line is Rav holds that from where do we know that if a woman who is a Yevama falls to a Yavam and that union is prohibited by a lav, that Yibum should not be done, even though you could have argued the Esa Doichaloisisa, is because the Torah is adding a word Yevimtoi to teach you that rule. That wherever Yibum is prohibited because of a lav, don't do Yibum. Do chalitza. So Masav Rava asks Rava, if the Isur is a Isur Midoiraisa, it says in our Mishnah that Isur Mitzvah or the Isur Kedusha, wherever one should not have done Yibum, if Ba'aleha, if he did have a relation with her, or if he did chalitza to her, then, like we said in the Mishnah, Niftar Tzarasa. Then the tzara became completely freed. If this is a doiraisa, that a man is not allowed to do yibum, even though there's only a lav, why would the din be that if this person wrongfully had a relation with this woman, that, so to say, did a yibum, it should be nothing. It should be worthless, because God said don't do it. See, if it's only a rabbinic law, it makes sense. But according to Rav, he found the verse Yevimtoi, then having a relation, the Kohen Gadol, with this almana should have no effect on the co-wife. It should be an act of no halachic value at all. So who meisav love, who mefarik law, Rava asked, and Rava answered that you're right. That letzdad and ketani. This is the way we have to read the Braisa. That ba'aleh isur mitzvah. That if the living brother had a relation with the widow, if the widow was only prohibited rabbinically, shniyos, or if he did chalitza wherever there was an isur midoiraisa, isur kedusha, that's where the tzara is completely freed. However, by heart, if the living brother, let's say the Kohen Gadol, Shimon, has yibum wrongfully with the widow of his brother Reuven, being that according to Rav, he violated the Torah violation, that act of relation is worth nothing, and therefore the co-wife is still bound to him, and she has to be freed either through yibum or through chalitz. Weiter Masav Rava. Rava again is asking against Rav, you Rav, who say that Isur mitzvah is asur midoiraisa in yibum from the pasuk Yevimtoi. It says in a braisa regarding certain men that are not allowed to marry a normal Jewish woman. Right? Lo yavai ptsua daka uchru shavcha bekahal Hashem. Ptsua daka is someone whose testicles are crushed. Uchru shavcha is someone whose organ is severed. Siris Adam, big machlokes what Siris Adam refers to. Rashi seems to imply that Siris Adam is a qualifier of Ptsua Daka and Kru Shavcha. When is a Ptsua Daka? When is a Kru Shavcha? A man who cannot marry a Bas Yisrael if they have these defects by man. It was a man-made defect. But versus if a man was born with a Ptsua Daka or with a Kru Shavcha, or if a person because of an illness became a P'suah Daka and Kru Shavcha, then biblically they are not prohibited to marry a Jewish woman. There's a big discussion about that, but let's move on. Or Vahazakein, so Mendy I have here, Zakein is at least by the man, not by the woman. Zakein means that he's so old that he can't have kids. Again, the point is that the whole point of Yibum is to build up your deceased brother's house. He's a Zakein. No, this is a guy who should not marry her. Now this, and here it's midoiraisa, should not marry her. Again, I don't know by a woman, but let's go by a man. P'suah Daka is a doiraisa. Kru Shavcha is a doiraisa. So now the Braisa is very elaborate. So what happens if there were, let's go to the cases. if de facto, if chalitza or yibum was done, it's valid. If it was done, it should not have been done. Case that, for example, mesu v'lehem achim v'lehem nashim v'amdu achim v'asu maimer b'nesheseyem v'nosnu get or v'cholzu mashasu asu. That if you had two brothers and they died, and the surviving brothers will be a p'tzuadaka or krush shavcha, which should not marry the widows. So if they did maimer, which is the pre-yibum rabbinic marriage, or if a man gave a get to the Yevama, we'll learn about this more later, but until now we learned yibum or chalitza, giving a get by Torah law means nothing. The rabbi said that if a man gives a get to his Yevama, rabbinically the get has an effect and he can no longer be with her. He has to give her chalitza still, but he cannot do yibum with her because a get appears like a chalitza. Or he does chalitza, masha asu asu. V'im ba'alo, but if these men had a relation with these women, then they become married, kanu. Or reverse, mesu achim v'amdu haim. So the first case is that the original brothers had these illnesses and they died, and the surviving brothers are healthy. Or in reverse, mesu achim v'amdu haim v'asu maimer b'nesheseyim. Or they gave a get, or they did chalitza. What they did is done. V'im bo'alu, and if they had a relation, then they're married. However, v'asu l'kaimam. However, even though they're married because of the yibum was effective, they have to divorce their wives now because it says lo yavi p'tzodaka ukro shuvcha b'kal Hashem.
If the original brother was p'tzodaka.
In both cases, so that marriage,
And the new brother.
that's okay. The question is on the reverse case, where the living brother now is a p'tzodaka, and according to Rav, whenever there's a chayvi lavin, God says don't do yibum. So the question is, why was the yibum even effective? If Hashem is telling you that whenever there is a lav, you're not allowed to do yibum, you can only do chalitza, why does this braisa say that if the person violated the Torah law and did the yibum, amai kanu? Should not have worked. And therefore, Rava disagrees with Rav. And Rav is going to hold that midoiraisa, a almana should marry the kohen gadol in yibum if she was only a almana from engagement, because an essa midoiraisa is takadoich aloisasa, and being that midoiraisa yibum should work essa doich aloisasa, that's why in this braisa, if there was a krus shavcha and he did yibum with his wife, even though he should not have married her. Why not? Because God says a krus shavcha should not marry a Jewish woman. God says a man should do yibum. Esa doicheloisasa. Why? So lachatchila, why not do it? So it says Rava that almana mino edus anami yesav loisasahu. That he says because there, even the almana, she's not only prohibited because of the negative commandment. There's another positive commandment. What's a positive commandment? Kedoshim yiu lelokeichem. God says, be holy also includes kahanim. So every almana, even if she's a virgin, cannot marry the kohen gadol. God says a kohen gadol should not marry an almana. And God says a positive commandment on kahanim, be holy. So the Gemara says, how do you explain that by the mamzeres or by the nesina? So the Gemara says, there also, God said to all of the Jewish people, v'his kadishchem, you should be holy. So the Gemara says, if that's the case, all of the commandments of the Torah fall under the positive mitzvah of being holy. There is never an essa against a loisasa. It's always an essa against a loisasa and a essa. Because it says, "Vis kadishchem," is kadishtem, that you should be holy. Elam Rava says that, like we mentioned, that a kohen gadol should marry the almana if she's still a virgin. That the krus shavcha should marry the widow because esa doicha loisasa. It's only a esa, and that's only a loisasa. Why don't we do it only by rabbinic law? What's the rabbinic law? Gezeda almana min ha'edusin atu almana min anasuyin. Because yes, if it's just exera. If the brother Shimon Reuven married his wife now there's two violations. She's a bu'ula and she's an almana. So the Chachamim were afraid to allow a Kohen Gadol to do Yibum when the woman was only engaged, because if that would happen, they might do it if she was really married. Ask the Gemara, what about a Mamzeres and a Nesina? Why are they prohibited to do Yibum? So the Gemara answers, Gezeire b'makom mitzvah, atu shaloi b'makom mitzvah. Normally we know a man can never marry a Mamzeres. If the living brother will marry his brother's widow, who's a mamzeres, people will think you are allowed to marry a mamzeres. So the Gemara says, that if that's the case, elama'ata eishes achiv me'aviv leites yabim gzeira b'shum eishes achiv me'imoy. Why is a man allowed to do yibum with his brother's widow? With which brother's widow is there a mitzvah of yibum? With one's paternal's brother's widow. With one's maternal's mother's brother's widow, there's a violation to do yibum. She's an erva. She's your sister-in-law. So why don't we always prohibit yibum? By saying that if you'll marry your brother's widow from the father, you might end up one day marrying your brother from your mother's widow. So the Gemara says that everyone knows that Yibum benachle tala rachmana. Everyone knows that Yibum is connected to inheritance. We learned this before. Because the one who does Yibum inherits all of the brother's possessions. Normally when a person passes away and they have no children, so if it doesn't go down, it goes up. And if the father is not alive, the brothers get a share. But the one who does Yibum gets all of it. And where does inheritance go to? Only to paternal brothers. So everyone knows that it's only connected to paternal, and no one will mistake it to a maternal. So ask the Gemara weiter, if a woman died, a man died, left a widow without children, so the Gemara says the Yibum should not be done, because if Yibum will be done in where there's a mitzvah of Yibum, then people mistakenly will do Yibum with a woman who had children. When the brother had children, he'll also marry the brother's wife. In other words, if we have these gezeiros, where do we draw the line? So the Gemara says, since the whole purpose of marrying the widow is to reestablish children, to build your brother's house, everyone knows that it's connected only to him dying childless. Made the yediyah, no one will confuse it. Ask the Gemara, Eishes achiv shoy b'yolamay, leitzis yabim, gzeira mishum eishes achiv, shaloi hoya b'yolamay. Again, let us always be afraid of Yibum because of the non-contemporary brother. So the Gemara says, again, b'yeshiva tala rachmana, being that the Torah says, ki yeshvu achim yachtov, we had this pasuk before, yeshvu means they both live together. Everyone knows that Yibum is only when the brothers were alive. When one died, the other ones were living. Ask the Gemara, Kol Hanoshim Leitis Yabma. Let Yibum be always prohibited, because maybe a man is going to do Yibum by an islandess. And by an islandess, there is no Yibum. Everyone agrees there's no Yibum. The question is, like Rav Asi, is the Tzara also exempted or not? But no one holds you do Yibum with an islandess. So then there should never be Yibum. So the Gemara says, islandess is Lo Shchicha. We don't make gezeiros for a scenario that's very unusual. Mamzeres and Nesina namin lo shchicha. So the question comes back: if midai raisa, even if there is a lav, esa doicha loisese, why should a man be prohibited to do yibum with a mamzeres? Esa doicha loisese, and a mamzeres is very unusual. It's very unusual for someone to have a brother who married a mamzeres or a nesina. So Rava gives the following answer. That I want you to know, you're right, by a mamzeres, really, the man should have done Yibum. But don't forget one thing. The mitzvah of Yibum is the first relation the surviving brother has with the widow. That first relation is the mitzvah. And a man should do that. But if the wife is a mamzeres, if even an almana to a kohen gadol, Esa doicha loisa says where there's a mitzvah. The mitzvah is the first relation. What about the second relation? What would have had to happen there is that the kohen gadol should have done yibum, had a relation, and right away divorce her. That the man should do yibum with the mamzeres and right away divorce her. The chachamim were afraid that he won't divorce her, that he'll have a second relation with her. That second relation with her is prohibited by Torah law. Gezeira b'yer shayna oto b'yer shniya, and tanya nami hachi, er imbo alu kanu. that when we learned before that if this man who's usher to marry a Jewish woman because he's a krushavcha. So we learned in the Braisa that if he did Yibum, Kanu. But it says in the Braisa, Bebiyar Shaina, he was kind to her because of the first relation, which is Taka Mitzvah of Yibum. But V'asr L'kaimam Bebiyar Shania, but he cannot continue to be with her. So a get is needed. So now Rav is back by saying, not like Rav, that whenever there's only a lav, this is fantastic. And there should be a mitzvah of Yibum. The rabbi says don't do it because Yibum would only mean Yibum and divorce. You might not divorce her before having another relation or more. Now, let Rava try to change his mind. Hadar Amar Rava or Ravashi, Lav Milsi Hida Amri, I made a mistake. He went back for a moment because since Reish Lakish said, Kol Makim Sha'ata Moitze Esav Eloisasa, whenever there is a collision between a positive and a negative, when do we say the positive overrules the negative? When you don't have an option. It's either one or the other. What happens if you can keep both? Then keep both. So Reish Lakish argued, there's no Esav Eloisasa by Yibum because there is an option. What's the option? Chalitza. Why should you do the mitzvah of Yibum, violating a lav of Mamzer, lav of Nesina? Do Chalitza, it's also a mitzvah. That Reish Lakish says whenever you have an Esen Loisa say, if you can keep both, then keep both. Only if you can't do we say Yavi Esav Yitcha Loisa. And here also Chalitza could be done, and the Chalitza is the keeping of the positive commandment. And therefore, Rava for a moment says, no. An almana to a kohen gadol is asur midoy raisa. But then the Gemara says it's not correct. Because since it says in the Braisa regarding the Psuadak and the Kruz Shavcha and the Zakein or other people that are asur, that in Ba'alu Kanu, that if they had a relation, their marriage went into effect, that proves that midoy raisa ese doy chaloisasa. And therefore, to Yufta, what Rava's regret, and the conclusion is that when the Mishnah spoke about Isur Mitzvah, Isur Kedusha, no Yibum, Midirabanan. Why? Biyar Shaina, Atu Biyar Shnia. Now, just to say the following, that when we learn the idea of Kedusha, or Kaddish Atzmacha B'muterlach, so just to know, there's this famous statement that instead of reading b'muterlach, it's b'moiser. Moiser means in excess. Abstain from excess. In other words, Kaddish Atzmacha b'muterlach means to be moderate. But what's even more important is just to say the following, that even though here, al pinigla, the literal meaning of Kaddish Atzmacha b'muterlach means refrain from things, even if they are permissible. Means whatever God says don't do, don't do. Even the things that God says you could do, not everything you have to do. In other words, Kedusha means separating yourself. Rashi said in Daf Chaf Amud Aleph, La'amidu lihizoer. So in Chassidus we learn that the word lihizoer means to shine. And Kaddish Atzmacha b'muterlach is not only a negative, not to do that even though you are allowed to. Kaddish Atzmacha b'muterlach means when you are doing things that you are allowed to do it in a way that you elevate it. Or the opposite, that we have a concept that in the beginning of one's service to Hashem, when a person is younger and the Yetzer Hara is stronger, there a person has to add many, many fences. Or what is prohibited and what's permissible is not needed. But when a person gets older, the ultimate goal is that a person should do the things that are permitted, but a person should do it in a way that kol masecha yil l'shem shamayim, because when a person eats something that's kosher, and the person uses that energy to serve Hashem, then the person is mekadesh that which was mutter. Something that was neutral can become elevated and holy when you use it, when you do it in a way that it leads you to serve Hashem on a better and a higher level. We'll stop over here. God willing, continue tomorrow.